When you're first starting a podcast, the editing and the audio production can be terrifying. So I thought in this video, I would answer the question, do I really need to edit? And also answer what is the minimum amount of editing required? How long does it take? And then I'm gonna finish up the video by sharing with you the best tools to get started and to make editing really easy. We've got a lot to learn, so we better get going. Hey, welcome to the Pod Sound School. I'm Studio Steve. I'm an audio engineer, podcast producer, and video producer by trade, and I am crazy about podcasts. And today in this video, I'm really excited to settle this once and for all. Do you really need to edit your podcast? How long does it take? What are the tools that you really need to be able to edit a podcast? If this is your first time to our channel, welcome. We are obsessed with all things podcasting. We hand the undiscovered the microphone and get the uncomfortable in front of the camera to take their online content to the next level. So if you're interested in content creation, podcasting, all of that, make sure you hit subscribe here on our channel and press the like button to let me know you liked this video. Okay, so let's divide this video into 3 parts. First, we're gonna answer the question, do I really need to edit my podcast? Then we'll talk about what are the minimum requirements when it comes to editing. Then we'll talk about what are the best tools to use. And finally, we'll finish up by talking about what is the quickest way and the easiest way to get started. Okay, so number 1, do you need to edit your podcast? Now, here you might be thinking, okay, you're an audio engineer, you're a podcast producer, so of course, I already know you're gonna tell me I have to edit my podcast. But hold on, let me ask you this. What's the difference between a podcast and a Twitter Spaces or a Clubhouse? What's the difference between a podcast and a recorded phone conversation or a recorded Zoom meeting? It's the editing. Okay, you could send me your Zoom meeting recorded and I would never listen to it. I can hop into a Twitter Spaces or listen to a Twitter Spaces as it's been recorded and play it back to me. And if that's your jam, if you don't want to edit at all, if you just want to hop in front of a microphone, whether it's on your phone or anywhere else, and not ever put that audio anywhere and edit it and have to come up with intro music and music to splice in and understand what compression and gates and limiting and de-essing and noise reduction and all these fancy words are, then maybe you would just be better off sticking with Twitter Spaces or sticking with Clubhouse. But podcasts, those are a different type of beast. And I can already hear all the arguments. Well, so-and-so never edits and they're one of the most famous podcasters in the world. Well, they're probably really, really good at interviewing and they also do edit. All of those people that you would say don't edit, they send that to an editor or they edit it themselves and they at least apply effects like compression and de-essing and noise reduction to clean up the audio. All of the podcasts do that, so that is not a valid argument. If you're gonna podcast, if you're gonna release a podcast to the podcast players, then you need to do at least a very minimum amount of editing. Otherwise, don't even bother with it. Okay, well, let's move on to number 2. So what are the minimum requirements? I'm gonna start by saying the minimum requirements are some of those fancy things I just said. But first, so this can make sense, really, I think of podcast editing in 2 different stages. The first stage is where we clean up. And the second stage is where we add, I like to say, the polish or the shine. The cleanup stage, I think, is really important. But it's the cleanup stage that you'll hear a lot of argument among podcasters. They'll say, I like to keep it natural. I like to keep in my ums and uhs because people like to hear that. And that's what makes it's like a natural conversation and they're a fly on the wall. You can hear by my tone that I don't agree with that, right? I don't want to be a fly on the wall sitting in on your D&D game. I don't want to be a fly on the wall hearing you talk about I don't want to be a fly on the wall in your room at all unless you're going to direct me and storytell and take me from one place to another and give me an experience. I've got a lot of things competing for my attention on social media, and I don't have time to listen to your random, pointless conversations. So the cleanup stage is a really critical stage where we can cut out the ums and uhs, we can cut out whole chunks of our conversation, and we can make our whole interview or our whole performance more cohesive and more put together in a way that is enjoyable for our audience. And then the next thing I really want to talk about when it comes to the minimum requirements for editing are your goals. Now, there are so many different goals that you can have for your podcast. For some people, believe it or not, the goals that they have for their podcast have nothing to do with the audience. The goals for their podcast are really just to have a podcast, to have it look like they have a podcast for social proof, maybe to help them with SEO a little bit, and then most specifically for networking. A lot of entrepreneurs and business owners love having a podcast because it allows them to approach people in their industry and interview them and rub shoulders with them. And the power of association is huge. The other thing that having a podcast is really cool for is it allows you to sort of do research and dive into topics really deep. And then you can take that research of the podcast episode that you put together and sort of repurpose it into fun little social media posts and repurpose it into a blog post and things like that. So in that case, if the goal for your podcast really doesn't have anything to do with your listener, with the people that you imagine are going to listen to your podcast, then maybe editing isn't that important. But if your goals are to network and maybe have a nice look for your business, then you do want to at least have a nice trailer recorded for your podcast that is professionally recorded and that has good effects on it. And we're going to get to stage number 2 when I talk about those minimum effects that you're going to want to put on each one of your podcast episodes. But you're going to want a podcast trailer, and you're also going to want a little intro piece that you can start your podcast with, and maybe even a little outro piece. Maybe you want something in the middle that has a call to action. Hey, I'm just interrupting this episode to remind you of this, or make sure you follow me here and there. You might also want a little bit of intro music to play while you introduce your guest. Those kind of things can be really nice, and they don't take a lot of extra time to just drag and drop them into your editing software of your choice. Okay, so before we get back to stage number 2, remember we are on stage number 1 with the cleanup, and then we're gonna talk about the shine. Let's finish talking about the goals for your podcast. I think no matter what your goals are, you should also really consider your audience. You should really think about ways that you can make your podcast be really enjoyable to the listener. How can you keep them hooked? How can you hook them in and then just keep them there the whole episode? And one way to do that is with really good quality audio, is to capture really good quality audio through a microphone and to do a little bit of research where you can find what microphone is gonna sound really good on your voice, what's in your budget. Do you want to use an audio interface with a good preamp? And what digital audio workstation are you going to use to make sure that you're capturing really good sound? Also, how does your room sound? Is it super echoey? And those kind of things can be very important. And those are kind of production things before you even get into the editing. So if you are like many of those people on Twitter and everywhere else who swears that they don't edit because they're keeping it authentic, then at least check in with what mic you're using, what preamp or audio interface you're using, and also that you're in a nice, clean, good recording environment. It is important to really value your listeners' time, even if you don't really ever care if you ever get listeners for your podcast. But I think you should care because it's such a cool opportunity to be able to connect with people and to be able to provide that experience for your listener. Now, the other goal that many podcasters have for their podcast is to attract a lot of listeners, is to attract a big audience, is to generate leads for their business. And if that's the case, then it is really important that you utilize editing. So hopefully I've got you convinced that you at least need to do the very minimum amount of editing. And let's go back to number 2. Remember I said there's 2 stages. There's the cleanup stage. That's where we're gonna cut out all the unwanted stuff and make everything a little more concise, cut out the fat, trim the fat, and make the episode sound better. During that stage, we'll probably also drop in our little intro piece that we have pre-recorded. Some people will hire somebody on Fiverr or other places to kind of pre-record a little intro piece that they can drop into their episodes. So we drop that in, we drop our outro piece in, and we've got this nice chunk of edited, cleaned up audio. Now we move on to stage number 3, and this is really the minimum. Even if you're not gonna do any of that cleanup stuff, even if you're just gonna drop your whole recording into your digital audio workstation, into your audio editor, and then throw the intro on it and be done, like many podcasters actually do. And I actually recorded a podcast episode on our podcast, the Pod Sound School podcast. I'll leave the link for that episode in the description below. It's called the 5 must-use tools on every podcast mix, where I go into a little more detail about that. So definitely check that out if you're interested in it. But you need to do noise reduction, you're gonna need to do compression, also some EQ would be really nice, a de-esser would be good, and then also a limiter on your stereo channel. Did that just make your head explode and now you don't want to edit even more? Don't worry, they're actually really easy tools to use. All you need to do is set aside a couple hours of your time, a couple videos on YouTube, a couple Pod Sound School podcast episodes. Make sure you subscribe to our channel or hit the save button on this video or the like button on this video so that you stay in the loop. We put out a ton of videos that can really help this make sense to you. You owe it to yourself to get high quality behind anything that you put out there. So these tools are really important because they make your voice sound more broadcast ready, more like that professional podcast voice that people are used to hearing, which then give you authority, just create a more pleasant experience for the listener, and will keep people coming back to listen to your show episode by episode. And you could really develop a community and a fan base, and your podcast will stand out from all of the many, many garbage podcasts out there on the directories full of people who claim they choose not to edit for authenticity or because they don't have time for that. Well, if you don't have time for editing, then maybe you shouldn't be podcasting at all. So the minimum requirement is that you'll at least have to spend half an hour, bare minimum, every single episode to make sure you apply all those nice, sweet plugins or effects that are going to make your voice sound a little more clear, a little more articulate, and a little more pleasant for your listener. Okay, so that kind of covered step number 3, which is what are the best tools to use. But what I really mean by number 3, what the best tools to use are my go-to and my favorite digital audio workstations or audio editing software. The big one for the cleanup phase, and also for those of us who don't want to learn how to edit, would be Descript. I love Descript. It allows you to edit and do that cleanup phase to your podcast like you would a Word document. It does that by making a transcript out of your audio recording that you can actually read and cut and paste, and it will take the audio out when you cut a sentence out. It's magic, it's amazing, you should definitely check it out. We actually have a couple different Descript videos on our channel here. I'll leave the link to one of my favorite videos that you can find right there if you want to check that out. And then the other one is Reaper. I love Reaper. It's a digital audio workstation. It's free to use and to download, and it's really relatively easy to learn when compared to a lot of the other ones. It's a professional solution. It's my go-to DAW for independent podcasters. And now we can finish up the video by talking about number 4. What's the quickest way to get started? All right, Studio Steve, you got me convinced. I don't just want to have a Twitter Spaces. I don't just want to ask my audience to listen to my recorded phone conversations with me and my brother talking about Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, fine, I'll edit. I'll put a little more work into it than that. If I'm gonna start podcasting, I'll at least dedicate an hour in addition to whatever rant and rave that I go on. I'll at least dedicate an hour to cleaning that up and making it more sensible for people to listen to. You can tell I work with a lot of podcasters, right? So my real recommendation for getting started editing is to take an online course. And I actually have an online course just for podcasters. It's called Reaper for Podcasters. I actually offer a free online training that talks all about it, where I sort of introduce you to Reaper and to my teaching style, and then I introduce you to the course. It's a free 45-minute online training where we start by comparing the most popular DAWs, and then we do a crash course through Reaper to really get you up and running, recording and editing in Reaper as quick as possible. You can find the link for that right where you're watching this video in the description box below. Also, if you want to learn more about the course Reaper for Podcasters, you want to just get signed up and go through a 3-hour step-by-step course to be a killer podcast editor, you can go to podcastingsmart.com/R4P, which stands for Reaper for Podcasters. So that's the quickest way to get started, is to take all of the guessing work out of it and just go to an online course. The slower way is to just DIY it and watch a bunch of videos here on YouTube. But a word of caution there are a lot of people on YouTube that are teaching the wrong information, or at least information that's gonna cost you a lot of valuable time. For example, many people here on YouTube will recommend that you use Audacity to edit your podcast. I would strongly urge that you avoid Audacity. It does something called destructive editing and can be a huge headache and waste a lot of your time. So I really want you to value your time and look at learning good habits to begin with, so editing can be fast for you, so it can be lightning fast. And then the other way is just to learn some recording fundamentals and then outsource your editing to a podcast editor. That can be very affordable. There are tons of editors that you can find online. A good place to look for that is Upwork, and you'll find a ton of podcast editors there. Also, you can just find podcast editors by going to social media and asking, hey, do you know anybody who edits podcasts? You'd be surprised. They're professionals, oftentimes audio nerds like me, and they do a really killer job, many times a better job than we could do ourselves. And that saves you the learning, that saves you all of the editing, and then you can put something out there that you know is actually gonna sound good for your listeners that you can stand behind and be proud of. I hope you found this video super helpful. I hope I didn't offend anyone. I know that you put a lot of love and a lot of time into your podcast. And hey, if you want to argue with me about how you want to keep it el natural, and if you think your podcast is just killer without any editing, drop your podcast in the comments below. I will listen to it and I'll give you some honest feedback. And maybe I'll be like, okay, you are one of the few who I can honestly say doesn't need to edit their podcast. But the other 99% of us needs to do at least a minimum amount of editing. We love you here at the Pod Sound School. We want to see your podcast go places. So don't be a stranger. You can find us anywhere on social media at Pod Sound School. And until the next video, happy casting.